Good afternoon to everybody. We made it at last, and I'm really happy because, as you all know, in eTwinning the last almost a month, we are dealing a lot with the topic of inclusion, and we invite you all to run projects on the topic of inclusion. So I thought that as part of the Creative Classroom group, it would be really nice to start the year with an expert who is actually come from a little bit far away from us. So Reva Joshee, and she is come from the university, she's professor in the University of Toronto. And she's going to talk to us about an interesting topic, and I would really like to hear, and I just saw a little bit the presentation, about slow peace. I would really like, I haven't heard about this thing before, about slow peace. And actually, Reva, my name, Irini, means peace in Greek, I have to tell you.
Ah, that's
Yeah,
perfect.
yeah. So I think it would be really interesting. And I see that you're also going to introduce yourself, and her background is very interesting. And I don't want to say more. So I give the floor to Reva, and I would like to thank her once again for being with us this afternoon. Thank you, Reva.
Thank you so much. Let me just make sure I know how to get this working here.
So you have the arrows on
Which
the
just go down here. Yeah.
end of the page, and you just turn the
There we
arrow. Okay.
go. Thank you. Okay. All right. So thank you all very much, and I hope that some of what I have to say today is of value to you, that you can use it in the work that you're doing, and I'm pleased to know that you're as I understand it, that all of you, if not, or most of you, are classroom teachers. So I'm going to focus a lot on the work that we're doing with a group of teachers in a place called Edmonton in Alberta, which is the second most western province in Canada. So let me tell you a little bit about me first. In that photograph that you're seeing is me with my parents. I am the daughter of immigrants. We arrived in Canada in 1960, but my parents actually left India in 1958. Now, coming in 1960, and there were 5 of us, I was only 6 months old, um, we were 1/20th of the immigrating population from India that year. Now, uh, what that means is that there were still quotas on immigration from certain places in the world, and from India in any given year, only 100 people could come. And so I mentioned that just because this was part of the structured discrimination that we entered into. Now, my father immediately got to work on a number of things in the community. That was just the kind of person he was. One of the things that he did was in the early 60s, there was a movement to develop some kind of an approach to diversity, what most Canadians at the time were either calling interculturalism or multiculturalism. And in the end, in terms of policy, the term multiculturalism won out. So Dad was one of the people who lobbied for that. And in 1971, there was a policy that was developed. I was 11 years old, and I remember the day that the policy came into being because it was a big event in our family and in our community. Dad continued to work in the community, as did Mum. Mum more a little behind the scenes, but all of us were involved in one way or another in the work that was going on. And my father, in particular, helped to found a number of organizations that promoted not only the development of identity within our community, the Indo-Canadian community, but also, or the South Asian community as it's now known, but also across communities. So, for example, he was one of the founders of something called Heritage Festival in Edmonton, which is an event that brings together some 80 different groups for a major community event, and it's become the biggest festival in Edmonton in the year. Now, I moved on from that to work for the federal government. I was at the time working for a department that no longer exists. It was called the Department of the Secretary of State, and the job of our department was to promote a sense of belonging to Canada, and included in the work was a program in multiculturalism, and that was primarily what I was hired to do. And eventually, I realized that government was not necessarily the place where I could do the best work, and ended up doing a doctorate. And my research focused on the federal involvement in cultural diversity in education from 1940 to 71. So really kind of trying to think about how did we get there? What were we doing? And along the way, my parents, both of them, were involved in founding the Mahatma Gandhi Canadian Foundation for World Peace, which came into being in 1988. And this had a huge impact in my life and my career. My mother had, both my parents had grown up in India during the freedom struggle, but my mother in particular had learned directly from Gandhiji. And so she brought those ideas to us, but it wasn't until the foundation came into being that I started to think more deeply about those ideas and issues, and started to bring them into my own work. So let me see. Just sorry, I'm just wanting to switch to the next slide, and I didn't quite do it. Okay, all right. Oh, that shouldn't say irradiation. That should have said eradication. I should tell you that on Thursday I flew back to Toronto from India, and I've been working since, and it's really been, I'm still a little bit tired, so sorry. What I wanted to do first was to give you a bit of a background on Canada's responses to diversity and what we have done over time. So that first one, as they said, should say eradication. This is one of the strategies that the Canadian government had over time. It was both actually physically to try to eradicate certain groups, and some were in fact completely eliminated, but also to through assimilation to get rid of certain groups. So the most heinous, I think, of these has been with our what we call our First Nations people, or the Aboriginal populations in Canada. The notion was that these groups were not seen to be civilized, and therefore needed to be civilized by the European settlers, and through a process of extended colonialization, there has been this attempt really to assimilate, but in fact to, again, eradicate through assimilation. There has been, even before there was a multiculturalism policy, some limited support for identity development for some minority groups, mostly minority European groups. There were large numbers of people who came in the early 1900s from Eastern Europe, for example, to help settle the west of Canada, and those groups were, in return for coming, were given some support for developing language classes, for example. Around the time well, just after the Second World War, really, the late 1940s, early 1950s, there became more of an emphasis on cross-cultural or intergroup relations. So the idea that where we wanted to focus was making sure that people could really understand each other and work together in this country that was still politically a relatively new identity. In the late 1970s, there became more of a focus on something called social justice, and particularly anti-racism. And this was in response to a number of high-profile events Racism was something that has existed in this country since the outset. But it became noticeable more when immigration regulations changed and more people from people of color could immigrate to the country. And with that, there were some high-profile events, including the death of a man here in Toronto who was pushed into the subway and run over by the subway train, that made people sit up and notice that there was an issue here that needed to be dealt with. And so a lot of focus was put onto this. Since the late 1990s in particular, there's been a kind of movement away from all of those other things to social cohesion. And this is something that I think that in a lot of European countries you've seen as well. On the face of it, social cohesion sounds fine, but in fact, the kinds of programs and policies that were being developed really had more to do with trying to get people to not focus on difference, to deny any problems that existed, and kind of work past them. So it was in a sense very opposite to the initial work on social justice, where what we were trying to do was really address the issues, but here it was in a sense to hide the issues and to use government policy as a way to kind of promote just getting along and certainly not paying attention to difference. So over the years, there have been 3 different variants of social cohesion that have developed. And I can speak more to these if you're interested later on. But where they show that there is some possibility of doing some interesting work through these versions of social cohesion. Will Kimlicka, who is one of the top writers on multiculturalism policy and multiculturalism programs in Canada, has said that it's at best this led to a neoliberal multiculturalism, and at worst to compliance and conformity. The programs that we've seen in schools in relation to social cohesion are something called Safe Schools. So this is an initiative that mostly deals with things like bullying and tries to get people to acknowledge that bullying is something that happens, and therefore we should pay attention to individuals and their role as either bully or as being bullied. So it sort of divides the world into these 2 categories. Sometimes a third of what are called bystanders. The idea, though, is that regardless of what systemic issues may underlie the issues, that it always comes back to the individuals involved, and there's a kind of I'm not going to be able to say it. They pathologize the individual. So somebody is labeled a bully, somebody else is labeled a victim, and that becomes, in a sense, the kind of identity they carry through. And again, I can speak more to these later on if everything is not as clear as it could be. Character education is the second kind of program that has come about. And so this is replacing versions of citizenship education where people were trying to get students more involved, more actively involved and engaged in the community and in what goes on in the community. But through character education, the focus is very much on certain kinds of values that we are all supposed to hold and tend to be interpreted in ways that promote compliance and conformity as opposed to engagement or questioning or any other kinds of democratic practices that involve conflict. And so finally, what these lead to is uncritical and depoliticized versions of citizenship. And I should have said earlier on that a lot of the issues in terms of diversity in Canada, diversity and inclusion, have been connected very much to citizenship as well. So that's the background. What we've been trying to do in Edmonton is trying to understand what what's an alternative way to approach these issues? What can we do that engages people in ways that don't bifurcate the population? So part of what we were seeing is that the older approaches, the approaches in social justice, for example, they gave us some very important information and some very important things to build on, but that there was this tendency, like the pathologizing that goes on with the Safe Schools programs and the anti-bullying programs, there was this tendency to bifurcate the world. Some people were oppressors and others were oppressed. Some people were seen as powerful and others were powerless, and that everything became a struggle between these two groups. And what I wanted to do personally, and what I found others wanted to do, was to find a way to get past those polarizations. And where I found it was with the work that I had started to do looking at Gandhian principles. And the group that I started to work with came together around this because we were all involved with a program called the Mahatma Gandhi Summer Institute for Building Peaceful Communities. We started this program, we meaning colleagues from the University of Alberta in Edmonton and colleagues from the Mahatma Gandhi Foundation came together, and we started this program some 15 years ago. And over the years, we have had something like 400 teachers in total go through the courses in the program. Again, I can talk to you more about what the program is later on, but the gist of it is that the teachers that I'm working with now were all students in the program at one point, and they were very taken by Gandhian principles and wanted to try and find ways to really enact these principles in their classrooms. And we had worked together for some time when they said to me, you have to theorize what we're doing. And when I said, it's Gandhi, and they said, no, there's something more to this. There's something that we are doing particularly, and out of that came this notion of slow peace. So there are 6 postulates there, and I'm going to take you through them one at a time and try and give you some examples of what these look like in schools and classrooms. Okay, hang on a second. I've just somehow not advanced the. It's not letting me advance it.
Let me help you on that, okay?
Thank you so much. Thanks, Irene. Okay, so the first postulate is that we engage with Rob Nixon's notion of slow violence. And if you read the flyer, you'll notice that this is what I sent you to look at, was Nixon's notion of slow violence. And Nixon talks about really 2 major kinds of violence. Excuse me, I'm going to just take a drink of water. One was the one that what we notice most of the time, which he calls spectacular violence. And this is things like bombs going off or cars mowing down people on sidewalks. And he says this deserves our attention, absolutely, but that it doesn't constitute most of the violence that happens in the world. Most of the violence that happens in the world, he suggests, is what he calls slow violence. And that is, and this is a quote from Nixon, a violence that grows gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, and attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. And Irene, if you could move us to the next slide. I think it's going to be easier for you to do it than me here. All right. So as he talks about it, he says, slow violence generally happens to people and places that most of the world, and I always say, when he says most of the world, let's read elites into that, that most of the world sees as unimportant, and that the people who are most effective are not heard or listened to. So they're not seen as credible witnesses to their own exploitation or daily harassment. So let me give you a couple of examples. Nixon himself is most interested in environmental degradation, and he talks about the ways in which environmental degradation happens is allowed to happen in parts of the world that that people really don't pay attention to. So currently in Canada right now, in the far north, there is an island that is disappearing. It's eroding at such a fast rate that they can't even measure how fast it's disappearing. And yet it's in the north where there's not a lot of people, and it's not seen to be very important. And it's only just in the last few days that it's even come to the attention of the general public. And even at that, it's a story that's been buried in a lot of the news media. It's not really being paid attention to. Another kind of example that I like to talk about is when we are thinking about, let me see if I can get this working again. There we go. Hang on, is that the next slide, Irene, or did I skip over one? No, that is the next slide. Okay, so that when sorry, let me try it again. There we go. So violence in slow violence in the schools, for example, one of the ways, one of the manifestations of this is the current neoliberal paradigm that has taken over education practically around the world. So, as I say here, the hallmark of neoliberalism is a vision of society as a marketplace. And I probably don't need to go into much depth with all of you about this, but I really do want to draw attention to the fact that in education, the neoliberal agenda stresses global competitiveness, the reduction of public funding to education, the necessity for greater market choice, accountability, and an increased focus on competition, and I would say as well a focus on preparing people to be workers and consumers. I mean, basically, that's a big part of it. So when that becomes the focus, one of the things that we need to think about is what does that do in terms of our education system? So the violence in neoliberalism goes back to the fact that it's based on a particular economic model, model of capitalist economics. And I'm not an economist, so when I do my analysis of this, I really rely a lot on Amartya Sen's work. And the biggest piece of this, I think, is that using this kind of a model to base our education on, where there is a necessity that there will always be winners and losers, I think really what it means is that inequality is inevitable, that it will become something that is an ongoing feature of the system that we are perpetuating. Rather than us addressing issues of inequality, we're perpetuating inequality. And the students feel this. So how do we address this in schools and in classrooms? And I hope I've got it right. So the alternative. that I've proposed in another paper that I've written, and I'm happy to send you the link for that, or the information up for that later on, is to, if we must use an economic model, then let's use a Gandhian model. Gandhian economics is based on 6 principles, but the two that I think are key in terms of rethinking education are this notion of trusteeship, the idea that that shouldn't say accepting whatever you have rather than wherever you have, that whatever you have should be used in service of the community. So in the original economic model, the idea was that the uh, this was about material goods. But in terms of education, for example, if I use myself as an example, I'm a professor at a major university. I have access to certain resources. I have access to certain kinds of opportunities. I'm able to direct my teaching and research in ways that I want to direct it. I'm able to use my voice to get people to hear what other people are talking about. So some of those folks who are not seen as credible witnesses to their own, to the violence that they're experiencing, perhaps I can use my voice to promote their causes in as much as I am in partnership with them working on some of those issues. So I mentioned, for example, that I just got back from India, and there I work with a grassroots Gandhian movement that is working on a number of issues with some of the most marginalized people in the world. And whenever I go, part of what I'm asked to do is to um, provide some information to them about things that are going on in Canada so that they can make comparisons. But I'm also then tasked with coming back with various kinds of messages about the work that they are doing. And in particular, this time, it has to do with a global initiative that is being planned for the year 2020. And again, I'm happy to give you more information about this, but the basis of this project is to bring people together from around the world, young people in particular, to say we want to pay attention to the various kinds of violence that are happening in the world, especially to the most marginalized peoples. And we want to lend our voices to developing a new plan for how we can address these. And part of that new plan, both in terms of the work that they're doing, but also in terms of work in education, I believe is through this notion of non-exploitation that Gandhi also talks about in his philosophy of economics. And that is that we must pay attention to 3 interlocking aspects of privilege. And it's these 3 interlocking aspects of privilege that lead generally to exploitation across a number of different kinds of social categories. So the first one that he talks about is overconsumption, and the fact that the higher up we are in the hierarchies, the more we are able to consume, and that's both literally in terms of food and material goods, but also in terms of time and space. That you know, the amount of coverage, for example, that American news gets worldwide has to do with their place in the world system. And so it's this overconsumption that comes into being. Unaccountability, again, that the higher up you go in a system, the less accountable you are. And just as an example of this, I point to the fact that at my university, I have to be available for my classes, obviously. I have to be accessible to my students, obviously. But I don't actually physically have to be in this building. In fact, most of the time I'm not. But you know, as long as I say that I'm doing my work, things move on ahead. And the only accountability I have is that once a year, I have to write a report saying, here's how I spent my time. And that report gets seen by my peers, and people above me in the system. In almost 20 years here at the University of Toronto, I've never heard of anybody's report being turned back to them and them being told that they haven't been doing enough. So, but meanwhile, one of my best friends is uh, uh, an administrative worker here at the university. She is uh, the assistant to to a department chair here at the university. She actually physically has to be in her office, and when she's not, it's assumed that she's not working. There's so much more accountability on her shoulders in terms of who she is, where she is, what she's allowed to do and what she's not allowed to do. So that unaccountability is another key aspect of this. And the final is ease of access. And by this, what Gandhiji meant was that again, the higher up you are in the food chain, the easier it is for you to get other things. So the example I give here is that um, I have a nephew who graduated a few years ago with his Bachelor of Commerce degree and wanted to go work in a bank. Now, one of my students uh, works in a major bank in Canada, and I was easily able to set up a meeting for him with her. She was able to set up meetings for him with other people. In the end, he didn't go to work for that bank, but it gave him the information he needed to go to work for a different bank. Um, this is ease of access. I can open doors for my family that other people cannot. So we need to look at these principles. We need to understand how they work currently, and we need to use what we have to overcome what's there. So we need to be aware of essentially be aware of our role in ongoing violence. Um, so let me talk to you about a very specific case of noticing the violence and how this is addressed in Simone's classroom. Simone is one of the teachers who's involved in the project. She was very concerned that neoliberal push actually also was one that created more isolation, that created less community, both within the school and between the school and the surrounding geographic communities. And so over the years that we've been working together, and this will be our 5th year working together, she's engaged in a number of different projects that try to address this in different ways. So the murals on concrete barricades, she came into school one day and she noticed that the parking lot in the school had been surrounded by concrete barricades because the principal didn't want people other than the teachers parking in those parking lots. And there was only a certain moment where the chain was lifted so that people could come in or go out. What she did was she's a grade 1 teacher. She had her grade 1 students actually paint images of themselves and flowers and trees and other kinds of welcoming images onto those barricades so that they became signs of welcome as opposed to barricades. These are the kinds of things that she's tried to do on a day to address the day-to-day issues that that are associated with that larger issue that she's concerned with. She's been involved in year-long school-wide peace initiatives. She's been involved with food drives at Thanksgiving, which a lot of people do in Canada and the United States. But the difference with Simone is that she has her students think about what are the underlying causes. And these are grade 1 students, which means 6-year-olds. She has them think about underlying causes of why people have to go to food banks. She has her students involved in something called kindness boxes, and these are just messages of kindness that are randomly distributed in the community to let them know that, let people in the community know that people are thinking good thoughts and want to relay those good thoughts onto them. She's worked on an initiative of a peace quilt with other teachers and students in the school to develop different squares that relate to what each individual can do to build peace and build better community. So these are some of the kinds of very specific things. So those are the first two principles we've gone through. The first one being, let me just take you back to the 6 postulates. I should have done this. Okay, so the first one being engaging with slow violence. The second being attention to any form of violence necessitates concomitant action, attention to a practice of nonviolence that would address it. The third postulate is that our particular approach to peace and nonviolence follows from Gandhian principles. So let me take you back to what some of those principles are. I've already talked to a few of them. The notion of trusteeship and non-exploitation, those are on the bottom of your page. Ahimsa is the core of all of this. Ahimsa is a principle that's usually translated into English as nonviolence, but it means so much more. And let me take you to that next slide so that you can see what. Whoops, sorry, that's the last slide. Let me take you to the next slide so you can see what are some of the things that we are talking about with this. So Ahimsa, as Gandhi advocated it, is founded on a belief of the unity of life. So all life is interconnected. It's about nonviolence in thought, word, or deed. And in fact, nonviolence isn't even the right word here. It's to not do harm in thought, word, or deed. It's to serve others, to work for equity, to work through love and compassion and forgiveness. And now, this is important, respecting the just laws of the state, not the unjust laws, and to work for openness and communication. So under this rubric of ahimsa, or through this principle of ahimsa, one of the things that I talk about is the importance of thinking about the way we work in classrooms, and the fact that most of the time in classrooms that I have been in, and certainly across North America, is that the model in a classroom is debate, not dialogue. We are we're taught how to pick a position and then defend it. And instead, what we're trying to do is say, no, it's more important that we listen to each other, because in that model of debate, we don't often really listen to each other except to find ways to counter the other person's argument. So so we're talking about instead a way to ways that we can learn from each other. So to listen to each other, to really think about what somebody else has said, and to start from the point of saying, what do I learn from what this person has said, even if they disagree with me on fundamental issues. What do I learn from really listening to them? So that's the principle of ahimsa. In relation to this as well, we talk about examining issues of power within the classroom, both amongst the students and how they're located, but perhaps even more importantly, between the instructor or teacher and the students. And rather than in a kind of free-arian way to say, let's all just be equals in this classroom, I've talked about finding models for using that power that we have, because it's always going to be an unequal system between teachers and students. How do we use that power in positive ways? And so here I go to feminist scholars like Virginia Held, and I look to the model of what she calls mothering, what I call parenting, that in the best of all possible worlds, what parents try to do is use their power to help their children get to a place that's even beyond what they can reach. And that's what we should be doing with our students. That's the model of power that we need to take into our classrooms. And then the third thing I talk about is creativity, and the fact that to get out of the kinds of patterns that we have found ourselves logged in, um, we need to engage creativity through the arts and through as many different ways, through as many different artistic expressions as we can, to find new ways of doing things and to engage not just people's minds but their hearts as well. So, oops, sorry, I should go back because we haven't finished the principles. So that's ahimsa. Sarvodaya is the notion of that what we do, we should do for the betterment of the whole society. It's not the greatest good for the greatest number. It's that we need to bring everybody along. Aparigraha, or non-possession is meant, is in there because part of what we talk about is in terms of um, actual goods, but we also talk about things like in classrooms when the goods are grades, how students want. I have a lot of students who constantly want to know why didn't they get an A plus if they got an A. Why didn't they get an A if they got an A minus? Why didn't they get the uh, I even had one once who had um, a mark of 99% on, or 99 out of 100 on an assignment, and wanted to know why didn't she get the 100. So this is an attachment to possessions, an attachment to grades that we're trying to deal with. And then the final principle that we talk about a lot is this notion of equality, and how equality in Canada and the United States in particular has come to be talked about really in terms of two things. One is opportunities, and the other is goods. And we, from a Ghanaian perspective, we talk about equality in terms of dignity and status. And that's a very different kind of way of talking about equality, as you can imagine. So these are the principles with which we work. All right, so the next piece that I want to talk about is the notion of slowness, and how the next postulate is about stepping back to deliberately rethink how we engage the world in ways that challenge dominant neoliberal discourses of speed and efficiency. So the notion that here we are sitting together, and I keep looking at the clock to see if I've run out of my time. And I think there's so many things that I want to actually be able to talk to you about, to engage with you about. And I can't do that without giving you some of this background. And yet I know we're all in this crunch for time, because we all have to be other places, because our lives are structured around these notions of these neoliberal notions of speed and efficiency. We got to get it done quickly. We got to get it done today. There are ways in which we have to work on what we are doing so that it fits into other people's schedules. It's really, it works against building relationship, developing ways of learning together, authentically learning together. And those are the things that the slow movements teach us. So the little picture there is from the slow food movement, but there is also a slow pedagogy movement that Pink and Lewis write about, and it would be worth looking up their work to engage with that. The fifth postulate, I think we're down to the fifth postulate now, is keeping the big issues in mind while we work on the everyday. I talked about this a little bit in relation to Simone's classroom. I want to talk about it as well in relation to Monica's classroom. Monica is another teacher that I'm working with, and these are the principles that she works from. These are not that much different, I think, than what a lot of us would say. But I think it's when we get to the very last one, or maybe the last two, where she talks about students developing an awareness of social injustice in all its forms, and being able to have the confidence and I would say also the skills to speak up for themselves and speak out against injustice. And this is something she works on every day in different kinds of ways. One of the things that she does is she starts very slowly with her students. Now, she works with grade 3 students, so these are 8-year-olds. And she gets them to start by telling them to notice things. So notice people who are in the classroom who are often left by themselves. Notice students who at recess don't have somebody to play with. Notice students who don't have somebody to eat lunch with. And then she says to them, but when you notice, you have a responsibility. So the responsibility is then, if you notice somebody who doesn't have someone to play with, you need to go and play with them. And through this very gentle process, they move on from looking at their school, their classroom, to their community and the world. And so 2 years ago, one of her students came to class one day and said, Ms. Thomas, I noticed that there was a man living on the sidewalk. And that opened up the place for a conversation around homelessness. And then they thought about, having noticed, what was their responsibility. So then they went to the principal and they were able to lobby for a school-wide program where all of the students would be engaged in learning about homelessness in the city of Edmonton, and then putting on a play about homelessness for their community. They then took that play and they showed it to City Council, and really transmitted that message that now that you have noticed, you have a responsibility. And so that's the way that this very simple act of noticing and taking responsibility works in Monica's classroom and in other classrooms. But it's because she has really got this larger issue in mind about an awareness of social injustice and being able to speak out against social injustice, and in building that confidence and those skills through the day-to-day practices of the classroom. And then the final postulate is about a commitment over time. That we have agreed that we are going to work on this from here until we really feel that things have been resolved. And in order to do that, we come back constantly to this notion of ahimsa. These are some other definitions of ahimsa that we've found in the literature and that we could come back to over and over again to say, this is what we are committed to. This is the work that we are doing. And in that day-to-day, in the day-to-day steps that we take, these are the things that we are trying to do. I'm just about finished, and so I want to leave you with two things. The first is this quote from Gandhi that says, the difference between what we do and what we are capable of doing would solve most of the world's problems. And I think that it is entirely true. And the last thing that I'll leave you with is a found poem that that I created out of some writing that 5 or 6 of us had done together as we were trying to distill the essence of slow peace. So I'll just read it to you, and then hopefully we have at least a few minutes for a bit of a conversation. So it says, slow peace, unnoticed. It does not seek to announce itself. Slow peace, small steps, constant rethinking, continual action, not one thing or an easily discernible series of steps, demanding patience, humility, compassion, critique, slow peace, engagement through ahimsa. And with that, I will say thank you, and that's where you can get hold of me if you're interested in following up. So Irene, shall I turn it over to you to tell me if there's time?
Yeah, there is time, and actually there are 112 participants right now, and I can tell you that they keep chatting and sharing, a lot of things. And I think it was a really rich presentation with many ideas, much food for thought. I really need, to see it again and understand more things. But there were many comments, and I would really like to have comments or questions from the people here. I was trying, to get some of the information, so some of the things that they were sharing during your talk, so that some said that a lot of schools teachers work with their backs turned on each other, and that the key is teachers, and there were some people who were more optimistic and some others less, that they can change things, and how important it is to act and interact, to learn our students act and interact with people around them. And there was a teacher saying that she works in with marginalized students with poverty and with many difficulties, but she wakes up every morning and she goes to school and she really wants to make a change, and that we should start by working on our inner self, and about grading, which is a competition and we are stuck with it, and we should save that and give more emphasis on the human characteristics than the academic achievements, and that it's not about getting there first, but getting there at your own pace because you are enjoying the ride. It was one of the comments there. Uh,
Absolutely.
yes.
Uh, I want to thank all of you. I mean, I'm seeing all these messages on the chat thanking me, but I think it's the attention that you're giving. Oh, there's a good question there. Do I ever get angry? Yes, I actually do. I get angry, but I think what I've one of the people that I just was spending time with in India is a Gandhian activist. He's one of the best known grassroots leaders, Gandhian leaders in India right now. And he says it's not a matter of not getting angry. It's how do you deal with that anger? And rather than turning it on people, it's to see it as a kind of energy that you can use in a productive way. And sometimes that means, for me, stepping back quite a bit. And that's where that stepping back process comes in again. It's stepping back quite a bit to allow myself to get past the initial negative emotion, to say, yes, let's see what this energy is that it's giving me. Where do I need to go with this? What's the thing that I need to do? So that's how I deal with my anger. I see somebody else is saying they use their anger for resilience, and I think that's kind of what I'm saying too in some ways.
And I think there was another question, but they are writing too much, and I mean, I can't.
You are You are all so amazing. You really are. I do hope that you take down my email address. I would love to hear from you individually, or, Irene, if there's a possibility that we want to do something again, just as a follow-up, I'm
Mm-hmm.
happy to engage that
And also, if you
possibilities.
have to share with us, because you said that you have some, things that you could share with us that the people could read, it would be really.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah, I've got a couple of different papers that might be of interest, and what I'll do, Irene, is I'll
Mhm.
send them to you directly. And I realized I didn't put the bibliography on the PowerPoint, so I will send that to you as well, so that everyone has those resources or has access to those resources
That's
too.
great. So, any more questions? Because I see that people keep writing, but I don't know if there are any more questions. I can tell you that they are all very, they were watching and they were commenting the whole time.
I was seeing a very steady stream of things going up, but I wasn't paying attention because I was trying to get through my
Yeah, I can
things.
understand that. Um, so I'm just waiting a little bit to see if there are any more questions. I think it was, quite efficient, and in an hour, quite a lot of information to reflect and think. And I wanted to know how to deal with a hostile environment, meaning colleagues who think so much of themselves. We have a question here.
Ah. That's also a very good question, and it's a hard one, and I don't know that there's one answer to it. I think some of the time, the most important thing there is to go back. For me, again, this is when I give you these answers, it's for me. It's going back to thinking about what can I do in this situation. Um, I mean, if there are colleagues that are being hostile, are there others who aren't? Um, One of the things my father always said was he was also a teacher, by the way, and one of the things that he always said was that you want to work with the people who want to work with you first, and that others may or may not come along. And if they don't, then really it's not really within your control. But the other thing he always used to say is make it look like you're having fun because everybody wants to come to a party. So it's it's something that I've really thought about over the years, and there's a number of times where that advice has come in very handy. And when we are having fun, and whether that is creating an arts display or inviting in people from the community and having lunch together, or doing various kinds of things that are having an event where we have a speaker, but we either before or after the event have some kind of gathering. All of those things tend to bring in some of those people who otherwise don't come in if it's just about sitting down and working hard on an issue. Um, you get sick of being punched in the stomach and seeing worse people than you getting credit for what they don't do. You know, at a certain point, in some ways, that's a definition of the academy in terms of, I actually think that the getting punched in the stomach, I don't feel that anymore because I think I've stepped out of the way. I think when they punch, they're hitting something else or they're hitting air. Um, it, I don't know that people are worse than me, but they get credit for what they do because the system is set up to give them credit. So I'm an associate professor. I will probably retire as an associate professor because I won't make full professor because the kind of work that I do isn't recognized by the university as being important work. I don't publish as many papers as some of my colleagues do. Um, and that's really what's seen as them. I don't get big grants for the kind of research that I do. And that's what's seen as the important stuff that gets you the promotion. But a long time ago, I just decided that that was one of those material things that I had to let go of. And so it doesn't bother me at all that other people are getting those things because that's what they do. It's not what I do.
Yeah, and I have to say that I don't know if it is connected with what you were talking about, but I really believe that if you treat people the way that you would like the others to treat you, at some point you get, a positive feedback. And if you be positive to the others, at some point they can get positive. I mean, if you smile even to a person who is not, I mean, it's difficult for the other to stay, and angry and to be, very opposed to you. And the fact that somebody gets the credit, I don't see it like, getting the credits, because the people who actually see your work and the people who understand your work, you're going to get a good feedback from them. And I think this is the most important.
That's That's it. And for me, quite frankly, it's come to the point where I think it's just important that the work get done and that people recognize how important it is. And if somebody else wants to put their name on it, I'm happy for them to do it, as long as people will get, people will know more about it. That's what I care about. The people will get engaged. The people will work on these issues.
And it's always good when we have a good feedback from our students and from the kids at school.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. Students are key in all of this. Speaking of which, I'm probably going to have to go soon because I got a student waiting for me.
Okay. So thank you.
But uh,
Thank you, Reva. Once again, I think it was really, we are going to think a lot after that expert talk. And thank you once again for accepting my invitation. So,
thank you for the invitation.
and thank you everybody for joining. I think it was really useful for all of us, not only from the educational point of view, but also, from our personal development and to think different ideas that we heard here today. So thank you all, and have a nice afternoon there, Reva, and have a nice evening, the rest of you in Europe.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay. Take
thank
care.
you. Bye bye.
Bye.